All right, everyone, good evening. Thanks for being here. You can all hear me okay over this microphone, yes? Thumbs up, great. So this is the third MIE capstone workshop. I don't know how many of you have come to the previous ones. I honestly can't remember who's who. But I'm Nikita, the lead CI. And today I'm going to kind of give you some advice for your design review that is coming up somewhere between December and January. So I'm going to actually start with kind of a debrief about the PRs, some common feedback that all the CIs have for you. Then I'll just explain what the design review is, because I realize you might not be quite sure. And then I'll talk about some kind of approaches you can take for preparing it. What I won't be talking about too much is more the mechanics of giving a presentation, like how to create a good slide, how to speak to an audience. Hopefully you've had some experience doing that in your other courses, and also you can meet with your individual CIs to work on that stuff in more detail. So, looking back at the project requirements, there were a couple of common themes that the CIs saw across the board. The first issue was a lot of teams used a pretty illogical structure for their project requirements document. I think that's because the kind of preference is to use the old ESP template because that's what you're comfortable with. And while that template was great for in first year, making sure that you covered all the areas you needed to cover in a project requirements document, by fourth year, by the time you're doing a range of different types of projects for different clients from different companies, the expectations are quite different. And really what it comes down to is thinking about how can we make this make sense? What is a logical flow? What information needs to be provided before the later information so it makes sense? Why are we putting this here when it's disconnected from anything around it? So an example of that would be perhaps you describe the service environment very far down in your document after you've presented the FOCs, if that's what you chose to call them. And that's fine if there had been requirements associated with the service environment defined in your FOCs, and in the FOC section you referred to the service environment section. But most of the teams didn't do that, they just had their FOCs, then they had service environment just sitting there. And you don't describe how you're actually going to ensure that your design functions in that service environment, and you don't explain how you're going to test this. So, just moving forwards to your next deliverables, really keep in mind organization. Like, does this make sense? You can start with a template, but then once you've got everything down on paper, look at it and maybe reshuffle things so that they make more sense. And that issue ties to two of the criteria in the CI rubric. The organized material, so the relationship of elements to the main point and to one another is clear. And then to the logical progression of ideas at the sentence, paragraph, and particularly document level. The other kind of problem we saw in some documents was that teams had pretty weak evidence for their claims. That's probably because you're using simplistic research techniques, really just looking things up on Google rather than going to the most suitable source. And we had a workshop about that with Mindy from the library, and I know that not many of you could make it, but it's a really important skill to have because as engineers, you're hired to bring more to the company than what they can do themselves. So you should have some knowledge of disciplinary resources that you can refer to. You shouldn't just be going to Google all the time. So again, keep that in mind for the rest of your project. The result of these two issues was that it suggested, whether it was true or not, it suggested that your team had a superficial understanding of the problem in the project because your ideas were really jumbled, you weren't really showing any consistency between the problem you were describing, the client's needs you're expressing, and then the requirements that you're supposedly going to be testing your designs against. And that makes someone question your credibility, right? They're wondering, can this team actually complete the task we've given them? And I think you are all capable of completing the task, but you just didn't manage to communicate in some of your PRs, perhaps. So I'd really recommend that, hopefully you got some useful feedback from your CI and your client and your supervisor. Take a good look at that and figure out how to move forwards from there. And actually, I'd like to check, can you put your hands up if you have received feedback from your supervisor? Okay, so not all of you. How about your CIs? Okay, that's good. If you haven't received anything from your supervisor yet, get on their backs and ask for it, because they can't take this long. It's not fair to you. So I actually wanted to talk to you a bit about asking for better feedback, because that is a communication skill. You probably received a completed rubric from your supervisor, and some of you might not have actually got much more than that. So you're seeing these ratings at the different levels, you know. Sometimes you're meeting expectations, sometimes you're exceeding expectations, sometimes you're below expectations. And these descriptors are really useful for making sure that, you know, the grading is consistent across all the different teams and supervisors. But it doesn't really give you enough feedback to make changes in the future. So what you need to do is ask for that feedback if you're not getting it. There's a model that I learned about from Patricia Sheridan in iLead. It's the Action Impact Development model, and it's actually a model for giving feedback. So this is a way you can give your supervisor feedback about the quality of feedback they gave you. So you might say, you know, you highlighted some descriptors on our rubric, but we don't know which parts of our document they apply to in particular. So in the future, could you please indicate where in the document we're making these mistakes? It's a pretty easy ask, and hopefully, you know, when you submit something down the line, you'll get a completed rubric and you'll get some written comments in your document. Or maybe you'll do a practice of your design review with your supervisor beforehand, and they'll give you some really useful feedback before the actual meeting. Or at least once you do the official meeting, they'll give you meaningful feedback afterwards. You might also need some clarification. So again, the supervisor's saying that your problem is defined, but it kind of anticipates a solution or the path. And you're not really sure what this means. So, you know, can you point out where we anticipate a solution? Ask them to take an action. Or ask them about the impact. They've said that you only sourced your project requirements from your client. So, you know, we want to please our client. What's wrong with just using the client statement for our requirements? And hopefully they would say to you, well, as the engineering team, you look at the problem differently than the client does. So you need to do some research, do some more interviews to develop your own understanding of the problem, because the client's explanation is not enough to move forwards with an engineering design project. You can also ask questions that will help your development. So they've told you that there were some lapses in your professional etiquette in your PR, and you want to make sure that you're professional at the design review. So what are your supervisor's expectations? What do you expect to see in a professional design review? Or perhaps, can we get your feedback on our plan before the design review meeting? Because you want to make sure that you're going to meet their expectations, and you'd rather find that out beforehand than after the fact. You might have gotten some kind of marginal comments in your PR, but they might not make a whole lot of sense. So perhaps, you know, you open a page and you see this, some red lines, some question marks, X's through things. So it looks like, you know, for the first objective, the supervisor thinks that your team should have included other human factors considerations beyond just anthropometric data. And that's reasonable maybe, you know. Maybe it's not just about the measurements of this, this seat that you're designing. Maybe it's also about the material. Maybe it's also about the reported comfort that you're getting from the users. But then again, maybe you disagree, you know. Are you willing to revise this before you move forward in the design process? Or do you need to talk to your supervisor and justify why you're doing it this way so that hopefully they will understand and consider any arguments you make related to this objective in the future? Similarly, you know, for the second objective, I guess the team here decided that they're using an ejection seat to kind of benchmark the price for their design, which is actually a seat in a space shuttle or something. So, you know, it's a slightly different use. So I guess the supervisor here decided that an ejection seat is not comparable, it's not a good benchmark, and they want the team to look into perhaps the prices of other seats in other spacecraft. So perhaps what should have happened here is the team should have discussed their objectives more closely with their supervisor before they came and presented them at the PR. That's one way they could avoid this problem in the future. Any questions about any of this? Nope. So I'm not going to make you do this now because I learned at the other workshops that people didn't really want to do activities. But I would encourage you to get together with your team, if you haven't already, and look at the PR feedback. And even if you have, it's possible that you could use it in a more meaningful way this time. So go through the comments that you got, go through the rubrics, and have a look for any feedback that you could transfer to your future deliverables. That could be to do with revising your requirements. It could be to do with doing better research into perhaps the state of the art, so you have a better understanding of what designs are out there. Or it might just be communication type things, in which case you need to think about them when you're creating your design review summary. I'd say note all this down, keep it somewhere accessible, and then refer back to it before you submit anything else. Make sure you're not making the same mistakes again. What you can also do is prepare for this meeting with the supervisor if you do need to request additional feedback or if you have any clarifying questions. So prepare those action impact development statements and possibly prepare to negotiate if they disagree with your point of view. So now I'll actually get on to the design review, which I'm imagining you all have a lot of questions about because you probably haven't done anything like this since first year, maybe. I'm going to start just by showing you an example of something similar in industry, because design reviews are a huge part of industry, especially in larger projects with lots of different teams working on the same thing. Design reviews happen at various stages to make sure everything is coordinated and everything is on track in terms of budget and timelines. So here's a video from one of the NASA agencies about a design review they did for a program. I hope it's going to play.
To me, it's like a health check on the program. Those of us that are working on the program, we've got our head down, we're doing our pieces, and sometimes when you're working real close to things, you don't necessarily see everything. So this is an opportunity for fresh thoughts within our review team.
Part of the PR is to show not only yourselves, but to show the NASA community and the community at large that the program is ready to move on to the next level. Because there's so many moving parts and so many things going on at the agency.
And I have 4 major elements here in the program. Alex Frisco's has boosters. Mike Kiner has engines on the one.
Okay, so sorry you didn't catch the beginning of that, but the basic thing I'm trying to get across here is that, design reviews are a big part of what you're going to be doing in the future if you choose to work as engineers in more traditional design roles. And so looking at the student guide, the purpose of the design review is to present the chosen conceptual design to the client and the supervisor to obtain buy-in and to proceed with detailed design. So you're trying to get their approval so that you can move forward with your current plan. The design review is comprised of a client presentation and a written summary. The presentation delivers an evidence-based argument for the selected design concept that best meets the project requirements, and the written summary provides the evidence supporting the claims that you're making. So the written summary really is just a supplement here. The main part is the design review meeting itself, the presentation. And unless your supervisor has any expectations that diverge from the course, you shouldn't be submitting any other larger documents at this point in the process. It's really, the focus is the presentation. So, the expectations for the client presentation. It's conducted in the presence of the client and the supervisor. The team proposes a single design solution, which is derived from your analysis and ideation phases. So that's probably what you've been doing recently since you submitted the PR. You've been diverging and coming up with a variety of potential solutions, and then you've been kind of choosing between these different solutions based on hopefully evidence and analysis and other strong choices of justification. So the client will primarily challenge the team to demonstrate that the proposed solution will solve their problem within their business context, while the supervisor will be focusing on the engineering basis for the solution. The client presentation usually consists of kind of a 20-minute traditional presentation where the team is speaking to the client and supervisor, and then that's followed by a question and answer period, maybe 40 minutes, so it all adds up to an hour. Then there's the written summary. So it's a brief supplement to the client presentation, providing the best evidence for the single design solution that best meets the project requirements. And it also includes your next steps, your project management plan. And that will lead you all the way up to the end of the year, where you'll be submitting your final design specification, and you'll be doing the poster presentation at Showcase. And hopefully, to go along with those things, you'll have a final prototype or a final design. And the written summary does have a maximum of 4 pages. We've set that cap this year because in previous years, some teams were going up to 30 pages, which is not a summary. So 4 pages maximum. And you'll have to submit that to Blackboard and to the client and supervisor 1 week before your meeting. And I guess it didn't show up on that part of the student guide, but the design review meeting should take place between December 4th and January 12th. So yeah, here's the date here. The latest possible date is January 12th. And again, everybody has to be present. You could actually, depending on your client, they might have to join in online on a conference call, ideally with a webcam, because you will have visual components to this. And the suggested time frame is 1 hour. So after the presentation, there'll be a question and answer period, but that can also involve kind of more of a discussion or a negotiation. So they might ask a question that makes you realize that actually you have forgotten to consider something somewhere. So then you need to come up with some sort of agreement to incorporate that omitted component. Or otherwise they might say, you know, no, the cost is too high, how can you cut it down? And you'll have to have that discussion. You need to inform the program assistant of the date and the time and the venue and the attendees. That's because, well, first of all, to make sure that this actually happens, since it's not a submitted deliverable, and also because your supervisor's feedback is due back to you 1 week after the design review meeting. So hopefully the program assistant will chase down any supervisors who are too slow. And yep, the written summary, 4 pages, posted and submitted 1 business week before. And as you can see here, the supervisor is responsible for 15, the client for 10. Yep.
Sorry, is that date correct? Because this says 2017 and not 2018, and I remember reading January 15th.
Oh yeah? Huh. I'm pretty sure I updated it and I think I typed 2017 out of error, but I'll definitely check on that before this gets posted to Blackboard, and I'll post an announcement if it's wrong. Actually, wait, I have it right here. Yeah, I have January 12th on the course schedule, so I think that is correct. So this is basically going to repeat everything I told you, but I thought it would be useful to demonstrate something you might want to consider, which is using a PowerPoint slide in a more creative way. You don't just have to have title, text, image, right? There's a lot more you can do with PowerPoint than that. So I'm going to try and use some very simple graphics to illustrate this whole design review process and the different moving parts. So across the side there's kind of a timeline, I guess, going from today to the end of your DAR meeting. So that will be January 12th at the latest. And then across the top, I have some of the different stakeholders. The team, you, your supervisor and client, and your communication instructor wearing the communication headset. So hopefully what you've been doing recently is you've been kind of, now that you've defined your project requirements, you're trying to solve this problem. You're looking at the problem, you're thinking about it, you're coming up with potential solutions, you're investigating whether these solutions are feasible, you might be performing analyses, You might be analysing the system that you're trying to improve. Whatever engineering work you're doing is what is going to feed into all the rest of this. And hopefully when you are doing this engineering work, you're also documenting it. You're making notes about your decisions, you're taking photos of any prototypes you create, you're capturing any graphs or other visual data that you have. So then what happens next? So you need to start by, first of all, organising the time of your meeting with your supervisor and client as soon as possible, because people like to be busy and they are not very flexible when it comes to finding space in their calendars. And so you want to get something locked in before your client and supervisor fill up their December or January. After that, you want to start kind of turning your rough captured work into the basis for your summary and your presentation. And once you have something reasonably useful to show to someone else, you want to meet with your CI and get their feedback on that or get their advice. Then you'll finalize your summary and send it to your supervisor and client. Again, that's 1 week before the actual meeting. And you'll also finalize your presentation and the aids that you'll be using for it. Then the day of the meeting will be here, so you'll have everything printed, you'll be dressed professionally, and you'll have an agenda for this meeting because you're taking the lead. And so you'll meet up with your supervisor and client, you'll do the formal presentation, you'll do the Q&A, and then if everything works out, you'll shake hands and get their sign-off on your plan, on the design and on the project plan to complete that design. And then things will be great and you'll move on to the detailed design, or if you're an indie student, you'll probably be continuing to analyze the system and come up with improvements. Any questions about any of this? No. So, how do you actually prepare for this design review? Oh yeah, sorry.
So we've been told that our group is like a human factors project. So we've been told that we don't necessarily have to have a finalized concept for the design review. So what does that deliverable kind of look like? Because I know in the slides it says that we should be presenting the design. For us, it will probably be some amalgamation of research or some design alternatives.
Right, yeah, that's a common thing for a lot of industrial teams. Having either a human factors project or maybe more of a kind of interface design project, or even a kind of analytics project. You're not really going to have a concrete conceptual design that you want to propose. So what I usually recommend for that is A, talk to your supervisor about their expectations, and then B, the focus of your design review will probably be more about some of the major trade-offs in these things you're looking at. So if you're doing a lot of research, you're probably looking into what are the optimal choices perhaps, but then you're going to have to decide between, you'll have your larger issue that you're solving or researching, and then you've hopefully broken it down into kind of sub-problems or subsystems or subcomponents. So you'd talk about the different choices you can make within those categories, and then you'd talk about which ones seem like the best choices. If it's a really research-based project, which I'm wondering if yours is, that's more difficult because this course is really meant to be a design course, and so we try and avoid clients coming in with really research-based projects. But I'm guessing for you, the best option might just be to kind of present the main, I guess, a synthesis of all the research you've done so far, and then a concrete plan about where you're going next with the research and what you want to achieve with that. That's the best I can offer. So preparing for the DR. I'm going to give you some kind of step-by-step actions you can take to get ready for this thing, but before you get into that sort of detail, I'd encourage your team just to get together and talk about this. So have kind of a first discussion about the design review that you're going to do, and answer some of these questions, What are you trying to get out of this? How will you make the most of this opportunity to meet with your supervisor and client? Because especially for some teams, you hardly ever get to interact with them. Either your client is out of town and they're not making themselves very available, or your supervisor is just very busy and is not willing to meet with you every week or two like some other supervisors. So this is really an opportunity to have a conversation with them, let them know exactly where you are, and also let them know what you need from them. You can think about whether you do want to do the traditional presentation Q&A format, or if you do want to do something more interactive. That decision might come from what you've seen in your previous meetings. You know, is your supervisor, is your client more formal or informal? What do they seem to prefer? Like, will they be willing to just sit there and listen for 20 minutes, or will they be like on the edge of their seat trying to butt in and ask questions already? Are you going to provide handouts? Are you going to provide a demonstration? Are you going to, I don't know, show a simulation or something? And this is probably mostly based on the nature of your project. And then start already anticipating some of the questions you're going to get from your supervisor and client, because you want to actually answer some of those questions in the presentation. And then all the ones you can't fit in the presentation, you want to be ready to respond. And then, of course, if you are going to have a conversation with your supervisor about what they actually expect from this design review meeting, prepare for that conversation. So prepare to discuss or negotiate. So here's the preparation process I suggest. Obviously, if you can think of something better, do it. This is just a recommendation. Like any template, it's not always the most appropriate thing for you, so think about that. I would start by just, first of all, determining what I want my main message to be for this design review. Then I'd kind of build in the sub-points or the flow of ideas that make that argument. I'd start gathering supporting evidence for these claims that I'm making in these sub-points, and I'd prepare any visual media that is part of that support. Based on all that, I would then choose my presentation format. Is it a PowerPoint, or is it something else actually more logical for this? Then, you know, work on drafting the summary and creating these presentation supports, getting them ready, run through your presentation, and then once you've started doing these run-throughs, iterate. So you do the presentation, you realize that you haven't actually got a good visual to support one of your claims, so you need to redo that visual. Then you realize that there's a bad flow between these two sections, so you need to switch them around. Then you realize that one teammate's not comfortable talking about this topic, so you two need to switch. Make as much space as possible to make these changes. Somewhere around there, you probably want to have your meeting with your CI to get their feedback and advice. And then you'll finalize the summary, finalize the presentation and supports. Again, spend some time anticipating questions and even practicing that question and answer period. Kind of a role play with the team members, perhaps, with one of you being the supervisor, one of you being the client. And then also prepare any requests you have for the client, because you might need data, you might need access to a machinery or a tool, you might need access to their facility to do some observations. So how are you going to deliver those requests at the end of your presentation? So I'm going to get into the details of all these different steps now. So what you don't want to do with this design review meeting presentation is just tell a story about everything you've done so far. That's not the point. That would work in some industries, but as an engineer, you need to be making a strong logical argument. So the first thing to do is decide what that argument or main message is. And really that comes back to purpose and audience, which I've talked about before. So what's the purpose of this meeting? What are you trying to achieve? The main thing you're trying to do here is to propose and then defend the solution that you've chosen that you think is most appropriate and best meets the requirements. And along with that, you want to also propose and defend the project plan that you have developed that will enable you to finish this design process. And then having done that, you want to get buy-in from the client and supervisor so that you can move forwards. So going along with that, I wanted to try and give you an example of what a main message might be. If you were in ESP in first year, you probably did something similar at the Design Review Gateway. And I know that teams there often took the approach of Design A is the best solution for this project because it performs best against our top 3 objectives, our highest priority objectives. And it was also, it costs the least out of all the feasible designs we could come up with, something like that. Or you might focus on something that the client expressed that they really care about. You'll talk about why your design meets that need or achieves that purpose. Or if you're doing kind of a system redesign, you might say, well, we're going to focus on changing this factor in the system because we've seen, based on our preliminary analysis, that it has the most positive impact on performance. You also need to think about where your client and supervisor are coming from. So again, you want to demonstrate that it solves the problem of the client, and you want to defend the engineering basis of your design, which means that the reasoning you give for why the design you've chosen is the best solution, it needs to be based on solid evidence, not just assumptions. And then so from that main message, you'll try to come up with a flow of ideas. And this is going to be a video of a student design team giving their design review presentation. I'm just going to show you the beginning of it, where they introduce themselves and they kind of talk about the agenda for their presentation. Okay, I'm not sure if it's going to be loud enough, sorry. Okay, I guess it's not. That's okay, because this is the most important part of it. So as you can see, you have the design team over there standing up and presenting. It doesn't have to be that way. If it's more comfortable for you to all just sit around a table and talk face to face, that's great. You'll usually actually connect better with your audience that way when it's such a small group. But I don't know if you can read it. Their agenda for the meeting starts with an introduction of their team, because these 3 students are part of a much larger team, so they talk about the different students within the team and their roles in the project. Then they discuss the project motivation, which is basically to design a drone that performs in water, so it's called a RoboSub. And I think it's for a competition against other student teams. So there are kind of well-defined criteria that they're trying to achieve so they can outperform the other teams. They actually then get into detail about the rules of the competition, and then they describe the design goals that they've developed based on that competition. And then they talk about how they're addressing the challenges, and they break that down into the mechanical, electrical, and computational components. So that's one way of organizing your ideas. So it's pretty standard. It's the background of motivation, it's the problem, and it's the solution. If you look at the rubrics, that can give you an idea of what you need to include. So on the client rubric, one of the criteria is that you present a diverse set of candidate solutions. And then on the client and supervisor rubric, you need to defend your selected candidate solution. So again, does it achieve the functions? Does it satisfy the constraints? Does it best meet your requirements, more so than all the other designs you've considered? And then another criteria is this adjusted schedule of tasks and resources. So the project timeline, the project management plan, or whatever you want to call it. Building on that, you probably want to have an introduction. So you want to provide background and context for everyone in the room to make sure you all still have the same understanding of the problem and of the project. So, you might reiterate your problem and then just provide a very brief update on any progress and changes since the PR. So if you have altered some of your requirements, you need to make sure everybody's aware of that. If you've done some experimentation and discovered that kind of the direction everyone thought you were going to go in is not going to work out, then let them know. Next, you might present your solution just at the high level. So give an overview of the design as a whole or the concept as a whole, or just a generally capture and synthesize the work that you've done and or the design that you've come up with. And then describe some of the more important systems and components. And at that stage, given that you do need to provide evidence of idea generation, you might just want to give a very brief description of the methodology you used to come up with your ideas. Because it's more important that you used a credible method than you list off every single possibility you considered. Following that, you'd probably defend your solution, which should be the bulk of your presentation. So you'd be providing the evidence that support these key design decisions that you've made. And you'd also need to discuss any assumptions, trade-offs, and uncertainties in these decisions, because you want to show that you're being really thorough and professional throughout this design process. That could be followed by your schedule of tasks and resources, which I'll talk about in more detail in a minute. And then, of course, finish up with a solid conclusion. So here you would reiterate that the solution does solve the problem within the client business context, and you wouldn't just say that, you would show how it does that with the best piece of evidence for that claim. And similarly, you'd conclude that the engineering basis behind your solution is credible by focusing on the key engineering decisions that you've made there, or the key pieces of data that you've come up with. So the schedule of tasks and resources. I noticed that some teams in their project requirements, their project plan or their schedule of tasks and resources was just a list of the communication deliverables. And there are a couple of problems with that. The first is the names of these documents that we use in this course are not the same as what is seen in industry, and neither is the nature of the documents necessarily. So they don't mean a whole lot to your client. And then also, the design process isn't about the communication documents, right? The design process is the important part. The final design you come up with is what everyone cares about. And the deliverables just serve to document this process and to kind of create some bounds on when you'll be working on different phases. So, the project requirements deadline is there because you need to have figured out what your problem is by the date that you submit that report. The design review deadline is set so that you've done some work and come up with a solid plan to move forwards to the final design, which needs to be done by the showcase date. So I've kind of provided a list of what I think are more appropriate tasks that you might want to include. You can still, of course, use the deliverables as milestones, if that makes sense to you, but you probably want to explain what those deliverables involve and what they mean for the design project. Are there any questions about anything so far? No? So you've come up with your main argument, you have come up with the flow of ideas that logically make that argument, and now you need to start capturing evidence that supports these claims that you're making along the way. So again, I'm looking at the rubrics here. So you need to provide support for the fact that you have been using appropriate idea generation tools. You can't just say, we did brainstorming. That's not enough. You've hopefully learned about other ideation methods in your education so far. And so, along with brainstorming and other creativity techniques, you should have also done research, right? You should have looked into the state of the art. You should have explored what your client has produced so far or what their competitors have produced so far. you should have explored the underlying mechanics of the technology, or you should have explored the underlying system that you were perhaps improving. So yeah, just provide justification that your idea generation was credible. You were doing good engineering work. The biggest part of your presentation that should have the most space and the most support is the defense of the design that you've chosen, the solution. And so in the rubric, it says that criteria should include these relevant factors: economic, health, safety, environmental, social, and legal codes and standards. You've already defined these factors, right? They were your requirements. So the point is that you are evaluating your potential solutions against the requirements that you came up with in your PR document, or the ones that you've altered since then. You need to provide support for your claim that you're going to finish this project on time and in budget. So that means allowing reasonable timelines for the different tasks. That might take some research. You might need to look up how long it takes to construct some sort of device. You might need to look up how long it takes to run some sort of simulation, however many times you need to run it. And then you'll need to do a more thorough budget financial analysis than you might have done so far. There are these other two criteria on the rubrics, talking about creative use of engineering knowledge and then kind of lifelong learning, so acquiring and integrating knowledge from beyond your program. These are obviously not claims that you're going to be making, but they should be demonstrated throughout your work. The creative use of engineering knowledge is what you're doing as engineering designers. You're applying your engineering knowledge in a more creative way than just doing basic analyses. And you've hopefully been, you did research at the beginning, and hopefully you're still doing research throughout, so you're acquiring new knowledge that you need to complete this work. You'll have to be careful. Again, I said this, but don't describe everything your team has done, right? Like that, you're probably going to be tempted to want to show how much work you've done and to support that claim by just talking about everything. We did so much research, we did so much analysis, we tried so many things, and you really want to impress that upon your client and supervisor. But it's expected that engineers do a lot of work. That goes without saying. And it's not necessarily about the volume, it's about the quality of work. So, don't do this. Don't talk about this whole process of what you've been through. Just highlight the best design and the best evidence. So, the design that you've chosen, it might have taken a lot of thought and divergence and twisting pathways to get there, but focus on where you got to. Don't focus on the path. So like I was saying, you do need to justify that your idea generation was a good process. And I think the best way to do that without going overboard is to just explain your process, explain briefly why you think it was a reasonable process, and then provide a few examples of the diversity of the types of solutions you came up with. So, I don't know, if you were trying to come up with some new sort of single-person vehicle, you can say that you considered the most simple, revision to a unicycle, and you also considered hovercrafts and, apparation or something, although they need to be valid solutions, so you might not suggest all of those. But the idea is just show that they were diverse solutions, but that also they were reasonable. You weren't just coming up with a billion solutions for the sake of being able to say you came up with so many solutions. You'll also be using a lot of media to support your claims. So graphs, diagrams, tables, all sorts. And like I said, making these look good and making them readable is really important. But there are so many pieces of advice and recommendations for that I don't see the value in talking about them now. And they're easy enough to find online or in textbooks if you're not too sure about them. And there are also things that you can discuss with your communication instructor in your meeting. Obviously, the most important things are make the text big enough, make the colors visible. For graphs, make sure that you can actually read the scale. Don't necessarily provide like a plot with 1 billion data points if you're only focused on a small area, or if you do provide that plot, show the trend line, highlight the important pieces of data somehow. And in my meeting with the other CIs, one thing that came up is that students like to include decision matrices as evidence. And that's okay, but make sure, as evidence that you've made a valid design decision based on these votes or these weightings. Just make sure that you're using those decision matrices properly, because there's just a lot of misconceptions about those, right? Like, if you're comparing different designs, it's good to have a benchmark design, perhaps the one that already exists, and then compare the designs to that one. Because otherwise your comparisons are really too, they're not based on solid information, they're more based on your guesses. And you might know a lot about the field, but just be credible in your way of doing it. So, now that you have come up with your main point, come up with the flow of the argument, gathered the evidence that you want to use to support that argument, you can probably start making a decision about what mode you want your presentation to be. So it might be a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation, so probably 20 slides maximum, at least 1 minute a slide, split between 4 or 5 of you talking for an equal amount of time. That's okay if that makes the most sense. But maybe you're just really focused on this one nice drawing or, 3D model of this mechanical design that you've come up with. In that case, why don't you just have a large computer screen and have the model on the screen and manipulate it as you want to show these different things you're talking about? Or why don't you just have a nice large printout and have that in the center of the table and everyone talks around that? Or maybe you just want to have a face-to-face conversation and occasionally provide a handout when it's necessary, or provide a printout of a graph or a diagram or a photograph of something. PowerPoint can be very useful, but you don't want to have to waste time making every slide appropriate if you don't have 20 different things to show. I was trying to see if there were other examples online, and I found that someone has developed virtual reality technology that they're advertising as something to use for design reviews. And SolidWorks and Smartboard have worked together to integrate SolidWorks models onto Smartboards to make it really easy to manipulate the design, take notes, make changes, all as you're having a design review meeting. So while PowerPoint is popular, it's not the only way things are done. And what this really all comes down to is the criteria that you see on all the communication rubrics. So tailor the mode, the language, and the organization to meet the needs and position of your audience. Formulate credible and persuasive support for a claim. So when you're trying to provide this visual support, what is the best way to put it in front of your client and supervisor? Or if you are making a presentation, how is the best way to, how are you going to incorporate it well? So, of course, there's also the written summary that supplements your presentation. The interesting thing about this is that your audience is going to see it at different stages. So you're going to send it to them a week in advance. So you might want to think about what you want them to know before the meeting. You might also want to think about your audience. If they're someone who you don't think is actually going to read this thing beforehand, then don't rely on them reading it beforehand. And then during the meeting, I'd recommend that you print out extra copies and bring them to the meeting, because you can't rely on people showing up with them. But again, what do you want them to refer to during the meeting? Maybe you have high-level stuff in your presentation, and then you have some details in the summary that you want them to be able to consult if they're curious. And then after the meeting, what do you want them to remember? What's the takeaway? If you are including material from your presentation, of course you need to reformat it so that it's actually readable and it suits the document design. And if you're providing additional material, you need to make sure you provide enough explanation or context. So that's similar to, say, when you're designing a poster or something, you want to at least have a caption for every visual aid, and possibly have a lead-in paragraph that explains what someone should take away from looking at this piece of evidence. Because if you just put it there without any explanation, then it could be misinterpreted and it could weaken your argument. So by now you're really close to being ready for the presentation and the subsequent Q&A. You want to finalize your presentation and whatever supporting materials it has. So by finalized presentation, I mean the actual delivery, the speaking that all of you will do. Of course, you don't want to be memorizing what you're going to say, but you do want to sound very rehearsed and very informed and prepared. And you need to prepare all the supporting materials that go along with that. So it might be a slide deck, it might be a demonstration video, some sort of prototype, drawings, whatever. And you probably want to prepare an agenda, because that's just kind of a good practice in formal professional meetings. So you're going to need to, again, rehearse, and part of that includes deciding who in the team is going to take the lead. So who's going to introduce you, who's going to explain to the audience how this meeting's going to go. It's often important that you do say, we're going to present for 20 minutes and we'll take questions at the end, because otherwise someone might try and cut in. You need to practice to make sure that you have smooth transitions between the different speakers and that you're not contradicting yourselves or repeating yourselves too much. And remember, like I said before, you don't have to stand in front of the room. It can look kind of silly, but then again, sometimes it is expected that way, so it can go both ways. Like I said, anticipate the sorts of questions you might get and make a list of any questions or requests you have for the client. When it comes to anticipating questions, part of that, again, is knowing your audience. So is your supervisor someone who gets really nitpicky about data and you need to be ready to deal with those questions? And maybe your client is kind of fixated on one solution, but you don't think it's the right solution. So in that case, you need a really strong argument for why the solution you're proposing is better than the one that they wanted. When you meet with your CI, they can help you with really any of these things I've talked about. There are 2 CI rubrics posted on Blackboard, but the CI is not actually going to be influencing your grade at all. So these rubrics are really just for formative feedback, if you want them to use them while you do a rehearsal perhaps, or they can give you topics to speak to when you're talking about your plan or when they're giving you feedback. So I think the most important factors that they can look at is, the first one is, have you actually planned and executed a meeting that will result in consensus? Because they can try to put themselves in the shoes of your client and supervisor and determine whether this meeting is going to go well as you've currently got it set up. They can also help you practice responding to questions succinctly and effectively, so they can give you some practice questions and see what your responses are like. And they can make sure that you are incorporating media in an effective way, because that can be difficult when you are trying to show some complex calculations or complex results. So all that will lead you to the actual meeting. And the most important criteria for that are, of course, your ability to execute this meeting and get to a consensus. So have your client and supervisor sign off on your plan for what's coming next. You need to make sure that you're demonstrating effective communication between your team and supervisor and team and client. and you need to demonstrate professional etiquette. And professional etiquette doesn't just mean slapping on a suit and being, deferring to your client and supervisor. It means being prepared. It means being organized. It means being confident in your knowledge and ability, but also recognizing your limitations as students. And it means providing solid engineering arguments. Like, part of the professionalism comes across in how you convey yourselves in the meeting, but a big part of it also just comes across in what you've prepared beforehand. So this is just a table of important things you probably need to do. The dates are all relative to whatever date your meeting ends up being. So again, as I said before, schedule your meeting as soon as possible due to everybody's busy schedules. And the latest date for that meeting is January 12th. As soon as you've got the time and date locked in, you probably want to book a meeting room if it's happening on campus. And ideally, you'd kind of pick a room that is a suitable size and has whatever technology available to enable your presentation. You're going to keep doing your design work, so ideating and making evidence-based design decisions to come to a proposed solution. And you need to make sure you're documenting this so it's easy to create this presentation. Prepare the summary, prepare the presentation, meet with CI. I suggest that you do that at least a business week before the meeting date, because that gives you enough time to make any substantial changes that you might need to make. But in the end, it's up to you. It kind of depends if you'd rather have their help closer to the planning stage or closer to the rehearsal and revision stage. You need to notify the capstone office again, and you need to submit the written summary. And of course, right before the meeting, print stuff out and test the equipment in the room. I recommend that you book a room at least 30 minutes before your meeting's due to start, just so you have some time to get in there and get comfortable. That's usually helpful. So we're basically done here. You can watch these videos in your own time if you want to see some examples of design reviews. I couldn't find any really good examples online, to be honest, but they give you a good idea of what it can look like. I think the first two were actually not bad. But for the first one, what wasn't so good is the students, when it got to the question and answer period, the students were obviously making stuff up. Not making stuff up, but like pretending they'd considered things in more detail than they really had. So don't be that obvious if you're going to do that. And ideally, don't do that at all. There are also other things you can think about, but I don't want to overwhelm you. ECP has some really good resources on their website about making arguments. And these apply directly to what you're doing, right? Mechanism descriptions, process descriptions, comparing and contrasting. And they also have a section about how to present results of discussions. So that can be helpful for teams that are doing more kind of research-based work. So that's everything I had to share with you today. Any questions about any aspect of the design review?
So for the presentation, what's the latest time we can present before Christmas? Like before the...
For the break, I guess that really depends on your client and supervisor. I don't know when the university officially closes this year, but it's probably then. But having said that, supervisors are often not available during exam period if they have a lot of grading to do and stuff. So you just have to talk to them and find out.
So if they are not available during exam period, then the presentation time should be next semester.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else? No. So these slides are going to be posted online, and as is a video of this workshop. So if you need to go over anything, it'll all be available. And you can always reach out to your CI or to me if you have any questions later on. Thank you.